love is just not a feeling, or faith, or hope, or courage. It's not just a feeling. It's a mode of being in the world, and it is a form of acting in the world, a disposition to behave in the world. So we come to what is love. Now, love is the key that unlocks the door to ultimate reality, which is to say, it is the most powerful way of being in the world. It is the most poignant mode of action in the world. And it's, of course, bittersweet. It could take us to the highest heights of the sublime and the majestic. And it could take us to the lowest depths of sadness and sorrow, because it's the most intense form of being alive. Tennessee says it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. So he's really saying, you want to find out what it's really like to be alive. That last song in Sondheim's Company of 1970, of being alive. The ups and the downs, the rounds and the rounds, the heartaches and heartbreaks, as well as the unbelievable joys and pleasures. So that it's in the end, we don't have language that would ever capture the complexity of love as a phenomena, as a force in the world. Right. But I would argue that it is a form of death. That love and death constitute the two fundamental poles of human existence, and that you learn how to love by learning how to die, because things inside of you must die in order for that new being to come out of you. And love is always, in that sense, associated with that new being, associated with transformation of your fundamental self, a deep metamorphosis that you undergo, a thoroughgoing change in heart, mind, body, and soul. And sometimes it goes all the way down to the molecules.
They say people's chemistry changes.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that has to do with that kenosis, that giving of oneself.
Right. So are you saying, did I hear this right, that love basically requires a bit of death, right? That a part of us has to die? Say more about that. I think our listeners will want to hear more about it. I want to hear more about it. Tell me what you mean.
Because just as there is no life without death, there is no love without death. And therefore, death is a constituent feature of the most intense forms of being and the most intense modes of behavior in the world. And so we come into the world basically as these little precious babies, but deeply narcissistic, deeply self-centered, self-indulgent. And love has to, in some way, either kill off or push to the margins that narcissism, to make space in your soul and heart and mind and body for what emerges.
Right. I mean, it is true that when you really love someone or something, that you are different in the world in relationship to all kinds of things. And you see yourself doing things that you would never have thought made any sense to do before. So you're
absolutely
everything.
I would go as far as to say, you're living in a different world.
Right. That's what, you're right. It unlocks the key to the ultimate reality.
Reality, exactly. So if you living in a world with no love, like Hamlet, let's say, who suffers from the inability to love, then you living in a different world than Rosalind. And as you like it, let's say in Shakespeare, let's stay on the Shakespearean tip, whereas she is the embodiment of a love. She's dealing with Touchstone, whose wit and humor is wit falling in love. Right. So humor humanizes at that deepest level, like Falstaff, to stay with the Shakespearean characters for a moment. And so when we're really talking about love, especially for Black people, I mean, good God Almighty, we bombarded every day of our lives with such intense hatred, be it implicit, explicit, conscious, or unconscious. And that's just what it is to be Black in a white supremacist world. And that's
Right.
true too, I think, for women in the patriarchal world, or Dalits in a Brahmin supremacist world, or Roma, so-called gypsies in a Roma hating world. Any group that's being degraded in a systemic way has to come to terms with hatred and contempt, and therefore love will have even more weight than gravitas in terms of changing them, transforming them. So the whole sense of a self-love and self-respect becomes liberating, becomes a form of freedom that is so magnificent and marvelous.
Yeah, yeah. You know what you're saying there, I can imagine people, some people thinking, well, we all have struggles, whether we're a member of a hated or despised group or not. And those struggles, are also part of the ways our love gets twisted. If we've been loved in a hateful way, as Toni Morrison so brilliantly puts it, right? The hate, people who hate, love in a hateful way, et cetera, et cetera. But I think they're saying something different, because when you're in a broader community that is bombarded, as you put it, and constantly under assault, and are considered, unhuman, subhuman, ugly, unlovable, and unworthy of respect and love. Now you're talking about not just your individual struggle, where the rest of your community is there to fill in and to pour extra into you, but a whole community that has to figure out how to work with the paucity of resources in this regard. So can you draw a distinction more between those two? Because we're not saying, I don't hear either you or certainly I'm not saying that everybody doesn't have their struggles, but when you're a hated group, now you have to develop a whole nother kind of resilience that has to be part of the collective practice in order just to survive.
That's exactly right. Because we begin with just the basic human condition of every featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creature born between urine and feces. Just the kind of organisms that we are. Just to be human in space and time, to come to terms with the death sentence in space and time, to use Kafka's language, means you have fears, insecurities, anxieties in the face of your unavoidable and inescapable extinction in terms of your body.
Right.
So that's just human. Now, then you got classes, you got genders, you got empires, you got a whole host of structures and institutions that mediate all of that. So you are absolutely right. We're talking about human beings who must then cultivate the capacity to love. They must learn how to love. They must muster the courage to love, which means you have to allow yourself levels of heightened vulnerability. Remember, the Latin for vulnerability is vulno, which is wound. And every human being is in some sense wounded. And the question becomes, what are you going to do with your wound? Is it going to shut you down? Is it going to close you down? You're going to be a wounded herder or a wounded helper, and healer and so forth. Absolutely. But when you got structures of domination like white supremacy or class-based oppressions and so forth, certainly when it comes to gender and sexual orientation, you've got such ugly forces coming at one that there are layers of challenge that one must take into consideration when you're talking about love. Because if you've been taught, for example, to hate yourself chronically, then it's very difficult to love others if you don't love yourself. I mean, that's biblical, to love thy neighbor as thyself. If you hate yourself,
that's not a good role model.
You don't have a self to give that is positive and empowering, you see.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in preparing for our conversation, and also in the class that you visited recently, is that we talk a lot about the violence of slavery, enslavement, Jim Crow, and so on, and up to the present, mass incarceration. But there's also such a history of separating Black people from each other so that they are penalized for loving each other. That it's a constant practice of separation and severance. Children from parents, from mothers, from impromptu families, during enslavement, selling people who were not related, but who created a loving environment as best they tried to do, were torn apart. And this was a consistent practice to manipulate and control. So I mean, when you think about Black love in that context, to actually figure out how to be a relatively healthy, giving, loving person is an extraordinary act of resistance, I think it seems.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's a major achievement. This is one of the reasons why the Black musical tradition, which is the subject matter of that magnificent course you and Brother Andre have been teaching at Brown. But the Black musical tradition is the greatest modern tradition of spiritual fortitude and artistic creativity in the face of grim catastrophe.
Right.
And in saying that, then it means then that, in the white supremacist world, Black love is a crime.
Hey there. Thank you for joining us on The Tightrope. For the full episode, please visit us at www.thetightrope.pod.com. We'll see you soon.